It's great to be joined once again by Luke Vargas, who's the United Nations Bureau Chief for Talk Radio News Service. He has been in the Balkans for a week investigating the refugee crisis. In doing this, he has visited 5 countries, 9 border crossings. He's interviewed dozens of young people fleeing Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, as well as UN officials and government ministers. And now he joins us from Belgrade, Serbia. Luke, let's start with sort of the logistics of your trip. Where have you been?
I've worked south to north, going from Macedonia up to Serbia, where I am now, then onto the Croatian border, to Slovenia, and then to Austria. Austria being really the first country in this whole chain where people actually want to go and stay. The rest of these countries, and everyone will tell you this from the UN to the people moving through, they only want to transit and they want to go through as quick as possible.
And what have been the changes you've seen along the route?
Well, the biggest one, just for public consciousness, is that we just got new statistics from the UN yesterday showing that 220,000 people made Mediterranean crossings in October. Only 8,000 of them were from that sort of traditional route, which is North Africa to Italy. So basically, 210,000 now are coming through the Balkans, and almost one of them has done that crossing via inflatable raft from Turkey to Greece. The major changes as it relates to this route are that Hungary closed its border a few weeks ago, sort of sealing off any of the migration routes going through there. It sounds like a bad thing, and it's not great, I guess, that anyone wants to close their borders and opt out of any responsibility here. But it's had a sort of unexpected good effect, which is it's consolidated the different migration routes. It's allowed the police, where they want to step in, to be able to have an easy place to come and intervene. It makes the journey faster and cheaper, sort of economies of scale. Anybody trying to profit off this route has more people who are looking for those sorts of transport services, and people aren't getting fleeced, I would say, quite as much as they were several weeks ago. So those are the major developments.
And there's been, a lot of the headlines around this are about how a particular country is handling or reacting to what is going on. Now you're in Serbia, which is not a European Union country. What has the process been like there?
So Serbia's motto for responding here is sort of, hey, we give you freedom of movement, which, again, really sounds great, but isn't all that it's cracked up to be. First off, people don't want to stay here, so having freedom of movement isn't that valuable. And freedom of movement also means you walk 7 kilometers from the Macedonian border before you reach any government services. That's a great place for people to sweep in, feed you misinformation about maybe the borders are closed, there's no government services, you need to pay me to take you in a cab across the border. Right. The exploitation is feasible there. And also, what's the point of walking 7 kilometers to receive a heat blanket if you needed it during that 7-kilometer walk? You're not going to need it on your forthcoming transit. From there, people take buses or trains, but they have to pay for them to move around the country. That's sort of the bargain the government has made here. Some people go to Belgrade, where I am now. It's sort of been interesting because there's a very volunteer spirit here because the government has taken somewhat of a back seat. It's sort of tantalizing and romantic to watch. You have volunteers from an Asylum info center who have a storefront here in Belgrade. They go out to parks where people are gathering, waiting for buses. They tell them exactly what their rights are, if they need medical assistance, how to seek it out. They pass out some goods. From there, most people, whether they came, right across the country on a government bus that they paid for, or they came to Belgrade, milled around for a few hours, and then got on another bus, they go to the Croatian border. And it's there again where you see some of the benefits of volunteerism, people playing music by the side of the road, volunteers from different countries. You've got a bunch of Czech people, volunteers who have come and are doing crowd control at the border. That's, again, a very noble undertaking and something that most people don't think is needed. But when the police aren't there, someone needs to handle thousands of people as they crunch through a transit zone. So again, Serbia is a little hands-off from the government, and I thought that would be a good thing. You don't want people reacting badly to police forces, especially if they're traumatized. But as you go into Croatia, you see that police force and sort of a militarized process actually offers a lot of protections.
Right. I mean, for people who are watching rather than just listening, they'll see in one of the videos you sent over people entering Croatia. How do things change as the asylum seekers go from a non-EU country like Serbia into the European Union?
Yeah, you've got this little corridor that's been set up that takes you right from Serbia. This is at Brkasovo crossing point into Croatia. There's a tent where the police on the Serbian side are just hanging out and chatting. And on the Croatian side, they're all there manning the border and doing what they ought to do. People put on buses. Welcome to the European Union. You get on buses, you go to a transit zone. The media aren't allowed. I don't love that fact, but the reality is get people who aren't directly involved in helping out of the way. You could apply for asylum there. Only 100 people have so far this year, negligible numbers. Then you are put on free transport. You don't get to choose, but it is free. You're either put on a train. I went to the town of Tovarnik, where people are being put on a train, taking them to the Slovenian border, and police are there at every juncture. They were a little bit rough to me at the beginning, or not rough, but a little not happy that I was there to take photos, but they were very nice by the end. And everyone, by the time I was talking to them in Slovenia or Austria, said, look, this journey keeps getting better, and the involvement of government, when it is being kind and considerate, they're not police dogs biting people like in Bulgaria or shooting at you, as you see with border guards at the Iranian-Afghan border, when they're there. And they are the best professionals to be handling disgruntled people or people who've trekked and are tired and needy at sort of their most vulnerable times.
We have this sort of confluence of factors going on, which is, as far as safety goes, there are police in place near the end of the journey that a lot of these immigrants are making. We have winter approaching. That is certainly in different parts of this journey, potentially going to cause some issues. What are the biggest risks right now?
Well, first is at that transit camp where it's all great during the day to have 20-year-old kids in yellow, pennies directing traffic. But at nighttime, when there's a higher desperation level and thousands of people desperately want to move, they are very ill-equipped. And from a legal standpoint, you have problems because these are well-intentioned volunteers being pushed to the breaking point by people who want to move and will push back against them. That needs to be sorted out, and that's a risk. Winter's a risk, though the Croatians and the Serbians are building winterized versions of their transit camps. I believe actually today the Croatians deployed theirs. The Croatians or the Serbians are following next week. But the biggest one, and one I find morally unacceptable, is the transit via water between Turkey and Greece. And it doesn't hit you until you see people showing you footage of having crossed the Aegean in these dinghies on their phone, that this is a very deadly piece of the whole route that the European Union has just incorporated into their planning. They're not exercising incredible pressure, putting it on Turkey to open up their border crossing at Edirne, the land border crossing, and there's no talk of any sort of continental ferry that takes you over a short strait of sea miles, as Donovan would say, between these two countries. It baffles me that this biggest risk in this route, and there's so many other considerations being put in about safety at various other points, but that the deadliest part of the whole transit is just being almost solidified as the way it works. And that to me is very upsetting, to say the least.
From the people you talk to, what country seems to be the most popular desired endpoint for people? And what about the applications for asylum? I mean, how easy is it based on the average application that's being submitted to be granted asylum status?
The destinations, they don't stand out on a map, but they are talked about the most by everybody: Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Norway. The reality is there are other countries that are accepting people who are applying, and specifically if you're from a certain country, there are various countries that I didn't mention there that are actually going to give you a much higher rate of acceptance. So the information really isn't being passed along all that well quite yet, and people are just going to Germany because that's what they know about. As far as the countries, it gets a little hairy here and upsetting as an American. I mean, Iraqis and Syrians are going to have their asylum applications accepted about 95% or higher of the time. Afghans, though, and this is the largest growing population within those transiting, it's lower. It's in the high 60s, low 70s. And that's upsetting. You've got to be facing persecution from race, from a religion, from political identity, social affiliation to get asylum status. The EU does have one for generalized conflict, and that's where Afghanistan would seem to fit in. The Taliban isn't targeting people because of their race or ethnicity, but because they are just trying to take over the country. And young people ought to be fighting with the Taliban, is their logic, or should be killed. Unfortunately, the EU says basically if there's any part of your country where you could go and ostensibly ask for government protection, then that sort of invalidates your application. And Afghanistan is right in that really tough area where we really sympathize with the plight of people there. But the current contours of humanitarian law are just going to make it more difficult if you're coming from Afghanistan and looking to get legal resettlement status here in Europe.
Last thing I want to touch on in the limited time we have is, for people who have been paying attention to the corporate media narrative around the refugee and immigration crisis, what did you see on the ground that either tells us the corporate media narrative is accurate or that it is not?
I'd say the biggest inaccuracy is this perception that there's something arbitrary about the time that people are leaving and the decision-making process to come to Europe. It's like, hey, I'm out of a job in Syria or Bangladesh. Now it's time to leave. People are leaving, and I compiled about 45 interviews, the date people left and the town they left from. And then I went to Google News and used that great search parameter to search a town name in the keywords and then the dates, a very narrow date range. And so many times you see a town in Afghanistan that someone left 8 days ago. Well, 9 days ago, the Taliban had an offensive there. Or a Damascus suburb where until the Russians got involved, the Assad government wasn't attacking. But then they did 12 days ago, and someone left 11 days ago. There is a big cause and effect between the military news we hear about on TV and humanitarian exodus. And putting that together may not seem all that profound, but it really makes you look at the headlines and realize everybody, or many of the people here in Europe, are leaving for a set reason. The enemy was at their doorstep. They're not just leaving because it's warm outside or some other sort of fun factor. This is out of desperation, and they waited as long as they possibly could.
Yeah, and too often here in the U.S., you see the complete misunderstanding of that sort of capricious nature of just leaving, when the reality is leaving the one place you've known your entire life is not something people are just going to do on a whim, and that should really be sort of the foundation of our understanding of what's going on. As always, great reporting from Luke Vargas, United Nations Bureau Chief for Talk Radio News Service, joining us today from Belgrade, Serbia. Thanks as always, Luke.
Thank you. Take care.